Brie, welcome to the Scenic Route podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, I am so excited. I'm really glad that you're kind of like my GPS for navigating like this current really foggy times of fake news, wild claims, and personal experience masquerading as like facts and science. And like we need to talk about this. I'm really
Absolutely.
glad that I have you as a research psychologist to um yeah, to guide me through this.
It is a messy, messy time. Fog is definitely the right word for it.
Yeah, right? It is. So, I feel before we like kind of go into why our brains like how they work that we end up believing others' bullshit and often also our own bullshit, we need to kind of like this make a distinction or look at what is information, what our what our brain understands as information and how we like also can work with that in terms of what is disinformation and misinformation.
Yeah, that'd be a perfect place to start. We can go over the differences between the two first and before we get into the mental gymnastics.
Perfect. Hey, like take us away. What do we need to know before we go into like looking at why do we believe certain things to be true?
Absolutely. So, a lot of people will believe or misunderstand that misinformation and disinformation are interchangeable, that these are words that mean the same thing, but they're actually two very distinct and different things. So, misinformation refers to inaccurate information that's shared with others just due to a mistake or negligence. But once you make the person aware of their bias or aware of factual information to make a correction, then the corrections are made. An announcement will be made, an update will be made just saying, hey, there was some misinformation. Here's the correct factual statistics or data.
Mm.
Disinformation, on the other hand, though, this refers to false information that is purposefully and covertly spread with the specific intent of misleading or deceiving people in
Mm.
order to influence public opinion or obscure a truth because harm is meant to be caused. There's something very specific and purposeful that the person that has created the disinformation wants to happen. And the reason why it's disinformation is because it's not good. If it was good, if they had positive intent, then they would tell you what the positive intent is. There would be no need to use deceit or to hide this.
Mm.
So, this is why people who have the resources to launch and sustain a disinformation campaign are so dangerous, is because there's a big difference between just a person shouting lies and nonsense just into the wind versus having teams of bad actors who can lead a populace down a path to their own detriment without that group of people even being aware of what is happening to them, or at least not having enough resources or enough of them in order to stop it.
Yeah. And when we see so much concentrated wealth right now as never before, which is kind of like the perfect breeding ground for just pushing your own narrative as disinformation.
Absolutely. It's very frustrating that the resources that we have available in modern day, like the internet and social media, it's really not being used on a macro scale in order to genuinely provide assistance and help to populations.
Hmm. Okay, so I think it like for our daily lives, this difference really matters. Like just to kind of like see there is a malicious intent with this information, and you not remembering something correctly is not like disinforming the public. Like there is
Exactly.
literally like something else, like there's something entirely else going on. And like if we're now, I mean, you mentioned the web and social media, right? Like what are subtle or less subtle red flags that might signal we're looking at disinformation versus, I don't know, just a very passionate person sharing how they see the world?
Absolutely. So, one of the red flags that you can look for is someone with the resources in order to sustain the lie. So,
Mm,
if a person would have the influence, the reach over a very large population, money, things of this nature, it
Mm.
would be important to pay more attention to what they're saying because very often it starts with a thread of truth. And that's what makes it so challenging to confront it. And we'll get into this in a moment because mentally, whatever you hear first is what you believe. That's your foundation. So if someone's able to get to you first and begin with the thread of truth, but then lead you down a very specific path, a path of disinformation, if you will, this is the very, very tricky part.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a really crucial point. If there would be no shred of truth whatsoever, I think more people would spot it as bullshit or conspiracy or whatever. But it's kind of like no fire without smoke, or like there's always like this nugget that is true or rings true where you're like getting hooked and then be like, oh, okay, yeah, if that okay, but you're not seeing that the rest is like on purposely deceitful, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, because it takes too much energy in order for us to strongly pay attention 100% for the whole
Mm.
thing that a
I mean,
person's trying
our
to relay.
time is like fucked anyway because of social media and general like mental load and what's going on. It's scarce,
Yes,
right? Capacity to engage with information is scarce.
100%. So if everything in the beginning sounds good enough, mentally we do check out because that's the way our brains are meant to function. Because
Mm,
if you were 100% paying attention all the time, we would get exhausted way too quickly. We would not be able to function optimally that way. And so,
mm,
as long as things sound good in the beginning, people kind of tune the rest out. And
mm,
then when someone else comes along and they're like, oh my goodness, I have had the time and energy to pay attention. This doesn't sound right to me. Unfortunately, usually we get defensive. We as humans, we get defensive and we're like, well, it sounded good to me, but you only heard the very, very beginning. You may not have as much information as the other person. And
mm,
this is where all the debates and the criticality comes in.
mm. You kind of brushed on an important thing, right? On how we like we just kind of like how our brain process the information, like we're checking out and then just like browsing through it. Like it feels like this might be a good moment to hook into um Kahneman's concept of the two systems of thinking and how our brain process information, right? Because they are very distinctive and um yeah, just very distinctive and both they're not like better or worse, like they're not meant to be judged against each other, right? Both are useful, but we're kind of like we have some difficulties with each and every one of those one system one and two. Like how
Yeah.
how do we if we're like we already said okay if something is sounds good at the beginning we're kind of like start processing it right away. So but how do we process? Like how do we think? How does our brain handle that?
Yeah, 100%. And I agree with you. When it comes to heuristics and mental processes, they're not bad. They're actually neutral. And that is a misunderstanding sometimes when people like myself are discussing misinformation and disinformation and how our brain processes that. It's not a critique of the heuristics. It's just we have to pay special attention when it's time when we should remind ourselves, hey, I need to engage in critical thinking. So let me back up, like you said, and
Mhm.
just lay this all out in plain language. So when it comes to
Perfect.
heuristics, these are mental shortcuts.
Mm.
That's all that that fancy word refers to. So what
Okay.
this, what
Heuristic
this
shortcut. We got okay, good.
exactly, it's just a
Making notes.
fancy word.
Okay.
When it comes to the mental shortcuts, what happens is our minds will blend our own personal experiences with other historical information that we have available to us. And this is where our minds blend all this experience together in order to create problem solving techniques that
Mm,
we believe we can apply to our everyday lives. So these are really quick, very quick engagement answers and resources that we have mentally available for us.
okay. So every one of us has kind of like our their own kind of like brain's version of life hacks.
Exactly. Yeah, that's
Oh,
perfect.
okay.
It's meant to be real quick, real easy to access, and not a lot of mental energy or effort has to be put into
Okay.
this.
Hmm.
And that really quick, automated, unconscious, if you will, effort is referred to as type one or system one.
Hmm.
It's the really quick, easy button, and our brains love that. Because
Mm.
research shows us that our brains will actively avoid resource demanding cognitive processes. So, unless we practice and keep up to date our critical thinking skills, we default a little too often to the easy button. And
Mm.
this is where it can get tricky with believing the disinformation if we're not
Mm.
practicing our media literacy and our critical thinking
Yeah.
skills.
Yeah, makes
Yeah.
sense.
So whenever we get into system two or type two, this is what the media literacy skills and the critical thinking skills are. It
Mm.
means that we're actively engaging in, as Kahneman puts it, as you said, thinking about thinking. You're actively aware that you
Yeah,
need to process the data
the
and
meta
really
thinking.
break it down 100%. And that's type two. So that's what we want to remember to use whenever we believe that someone might be trying to pull the wool over our eyes.
Mm. It already sounds exhausting, right? Like no, it might make sense that this is not, I mean, that like our default might not be accessing system two because it sounds like it requires much more energy from our bodies, and our bodies are kind of like to more designed to maintain energy in general and not like spending it excessively. So this makes sense that.
Yes, 100%.
Mm,
It's it's surprising how much mental effort and focus it takes in order to make very deliberate and slow decisions, to go slow and meticulous and methodical with our thinking. It actually takes a lot more effort and energy
yeah.
than what someone might originally estimate.
Oh, okay. We're gonna go into that for sure
Right.
because later, because I think I want to first look into system one, and already you kind of had it mentioned a bit about these, like, the fancy word is heuristics, and the
Yes.
the rule of thumb, or kind of like what we have. And I think it is important to kind of like go over maybe the four or five like most important ones so that we kind of like know what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think before we jump to the critical thinking techniques, I think
Yeah.
what's really interesting about type one is that it has the capacity to force the answer in some situations. So when
Oh,
you're,
how so?
yeah, so when your brain is actually unsure of an accurate answer, especially when the information is inconsistent with the person's worldview,
Hmm.
which again, when I say worldview, this refers to the mental foundations of who we are and how
Hmm.
we believe the world works.
Yeah.
So when someone encounters something that goes against how they believe the world works or who they are, this is when bias kicks in.
Hmm.
And this is what makes us susceptible to the disinformation because now the logic or the conclusion that could be used, it's not quite right. So the person being able to recognize or talk about their bias, it does depend on how big the gap is between objective reality and the person's bias or belief. So,
Mm.
the bigger the gap between those two things, then the stronger the person is likely to cling to their belief, no matter what evidence you have to provide to them. And
Mm.
this is when people double down on their belief in disinformation, is because the campaign started with a thread of truth that matched their worldview.
Okay.
And so they continue down that path of disinformation. So when someone else comes along later and tries to stop them and say, hey, this isn't right, we shouldn't do this, etc., that's when they defend the disinformation and protect it rather than being willing to admit their lack of knowledge or that their bias has kicked in and say,
Okay.
okay, I
Yeah.
agree.
Okay, so to avert a loss of face, potentially, and admitting I was wrong, which no one likes to do, I get it.
Yes,
They rather become an agent of the disinformation itself.
exactly.
Okay, got it.
Exactly. And you'll
Mm.
see this more and more as talking about disinformation is more in the public realm. It's more of common language and common
Mhm.
knowledge to admit, hey, I think that this is happening, is people get very frustrated and a little sad, to be honest with you, that they're trying to help others and say, look, here's some facts, here's some truth. This is how a different choice would help you more. And it doesn't matter how much evidence, how much truthful information they can get that person to access, they still want to cling to the disinformation. And it's due to this type one and these biases and these worldviews kicking in.
Mm. So you need to go all the way back to trying to see, to support them seeing the world in a different way, which would
Exactly.
go need you would need to like reverse years and years and years of conditioning.
Yes, exactly. It's it's very complicated, which is why I'm so passionate about this area of research, is that at the moment we lack efficacious
Mm,
macro countering techniques. It's there's not a box of resources, if you will, that we can
mm,
very quickly grab to try to stop the disinformation.
mm.
One of the only things that we have is something called the inoculation theory, and it's actually very rare to be able to use it. What it means is you have some type of warning to know that disinformation is coming. You know that a
Right.
campaign is about to start, and you're able to warn the people, warn the populace beforehand.
Okay. It's kind of like an
Being
ad disclaimer, like this post is sponsored or something.
exactly.
Okay, okay. Gotcha.
And
Well,
it's
back
so
to like
rare.
more simple language.
Exactly. And
Okay.
unfortunately, it's just so rare to be able to do that.
Well,
One of
you would need to know exactly person X is planning to launch a disinformation campaign like T minus 3 days on this platform, which
exactly.
seems, yeah, no.
Yeah. Not
Like,
really
yeah,
possible.
no. It's a nice
Yeah.
theory on paper, but it probably very, yeah, proves very hard to
Yeah.
actually like do in real
One
life.
of the only examples that we have is when the US intelligence community was able to warn of the impending Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's honestly one of the only examples that we have. Because, like what you were saying, anything else is just too unlikely. It's too unrealistic to warn people beforehand.
Mm,
A distant second technique is using humor. So you are able to make fun of the disinformation and just be like, this is ridiculous. I can't believe this guy, and draw attention to why it's so ridiculous. And using humor is shown to have an effect. It is shown to lessen the strength of the disinformation.
mm. Yeah, I feel this. I mean, yeah, I agree. Humor seems to be like a really great way of doing that. But again, like it probably would only be effective if your platform is as big or bigger as your opponents, right? I mean, if I don't know, the president of the United States, not name, not I'm not gonna say his name. Um,
We can mention past ones.
yeah, we can mention
That
passwords.
that's
That's
more
fine,
relevant.
right? But like, I mean, any president, it doesn't matter, right? And I, with my teeny, tiny, weeny, tiny platform, would be like, ha ha ha, using humor, right? Like it, the the proportions are completely out of control, right? I think humor could only work among like more or less equals.
100%. Yes, exactly.
Mm,
Yep.
okay,
And
so we're
so
back
that
to square one. We don't like from a scientific perspective from the scientific community, we currently have a really hard time going at disinformation on a macro level.
exactly. And so that's why informing people how critical it is that they remain engaged with media literacy and their own personal critical thinking techniques
Mm,
is all we have. And it's so important for people to keep those skills up to date, to keep those beefed up
yeah,
in order to prevent these campaigns from, reaching in and clutching onto a populace and negatively affecting them.
yeah, because as you've said, once they kind of like get a little hook, hook inside you. It's
Yep.
almost kind of like too late because it will require even more like mental strength to kind of like unclaw and get back out again, right? Like,
Absolutely. Yep.
oh, okay. So,
Yeah.
okay, then how with this flood of information and this fog of disinformation, how can we maybe what does it make sense to first talk about how can we train media literacy, like you said? Or are you like, no, Jen, we actually need to talk first about critical thinking?
Oh, no, it's perfect. I think it's also a great idea to start with the media literacy.
Okay. Then, Brie, what the fuck? What can we do?
I got you. Let's get right into
Hit it.
it. So, media literacy, this is the process of enhancing your critical thinking skills
Mm,
via learning how to more thoroughly analyze, evaluate, and communicate message information. So, what this is referring to are educational programs that are designed to reduce the harmful effects, the media effects, and prevent risky behaviors in a populace. So, technically, media literacy is a type of critical thinking, but it does deserve its own highlight just due to the
yeah.
topic.
Yeah, makes sense. Hmm.
Yeah. So, one example of media literacy is being aware of your own personal biases, because we do have them. That's just what a part of what makes us human. None of us get to go through life without having bias. And so it's just really important to say, hey, I'm human. I have bias. This is what I think my biases are. That way, in case you come across something that triggers one of those biases when you are reading literature online or watching videos online, that at least it's a mental reminder to where it is a useful and helpful mental trigger, if you will,
Mm,
to your brain realizes, oh, wait a second, I recognize that. I need to switch into type two or system two thinking.
okay. Well, but how I can already like hear listeners at this point. But Brie, how can I know my own bias? Right? Because this is now also where blind spot theory comes in. How do I know what I don't know?
Yes, yes, that's a very good point. So what we can do is just go with an easy example. So
Please.
for instance, if you believe that you're personally really far to the left politically or really far to the right politically, that would be an example of a bias. So just recognizing that that's one of your biases and that's the type of information that you go
Yeah.
for.
Yeah.
It
For me, I know this bias. I'm proud of it. It's okay. I'm a left snowflake. I can live with it. It's okay. Come at me.
Yeah, same. I'm right there with you. So, one of the things that we can do in order to mitigate this bias is to say, okay, if I typically access news and read news that's really far left, for instance, what you can try to do is engage with very reliable and centrist sources and compare it to what you usually read. So,
Okay.
this can help you explore not only your own biases, but also the biases of your typical news source or information source, and
Mm,
that whether or why you've been missing some key data points that can help you make more informed choices.
okay. And in all of this, I'm just wondering, like, how do other mental models like cognitive dissonance or self-fulfilling prophecy play into this, right? If I well, I mean, I know when my personal worldview is conservative, let's go with that. I might look for more information that kind of like confirm my conservative worldview, that kind of like reinforce me in my belief that conservatism is what I want for life.
Yeah,
Like
that
how like do they play like do cognitive dissonance or self-fulfilling prophecy, do they play into that, or is it like not something that kind of like fits into what we're currently talking about with information?
oh, you're totally right. It 100% is part of this puzzle and it definitely plays
Okay.
into it. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, for example, with cognitive dissonance, that is part of that worldview that I was talking about.
Mm,
And your brain really does perceive it as a threat, a true threat to cause you harm. And that plays into the mental model of why people are so resistant to factual information.
Mm.
Because if the brain perceives its foundational information, foundational being, like who you are as a being, as being threatened by this other data, it's perceived as a real threat to your personhood, who you are, and it will actively resist any other data that does not maintain that foundation. And this is why you can't just sit down one time with a person and present to them useful and helpful information and say, "Hey, I'm helping you out. Here you go." And
Hope you
someone
know now.
easily, yeah, and someone being like, "Oh,
Yeah.
not a problem." Let me completely realign my worldview and build a whole new mental foundation. And
Yeah,
it's,
okay. So it goes then more into like cognitive behavioral therapy, or really like you need to actively
yes,
change over and over and again. Okay.
yes. And that's part of the frustration for researchers is that there's no macro way to do that quickly and successful. You can do it
There's
one
no
on
macro
one.
way to do anything quickly and successfully. I mean, as a sociologist, let me
Touche.
tell you this.
Touche.
Psychology is wishful thinking.
I think it's just frustrating because it's disinformation is such an easy button. Like, how come it works the
You know,
bad
my
way?
favorite studies were nothing but frustrating.
Oh goodness, no. That you know you're yeah,
Sorry, but they're all
you're
fun.
totally right. Yeah.
But
So
no,
like you're saying, you can sit down one on one with someone and eventually over time help them out. But it would take so much time and effort.
yeah, and if they want to be helped, or if they like,
Yes.
if they are open enough to be like, hey, right, I'm open to having a discourse.
Yes.
And I feel this is currently very much not the case anymore. Uh, Goes for both sides, right? I also sometimes
Right.
like how why should I want a discourse with people who want to like who are actively endangering the lives of people I love? Right?
Hmm.
It's really hard to kind of like soften this up and be like, no, well, we actually need a discourse
Yep.
to
Yeah,
keep
absolutely. It's
moving.
why having strategists, people who are genuinely trained on strategic communication are so important
Mm,
because the more consistent you are about your own messaging of, okay, this is what's really happening, or this is how we're trying to help you as a populace. That's why that's so important is to repeat that over and over and over again.
mm.
Because the better we can be at strategic communication, the less effective disinformation campaigns are.
Yeah, makes sense. I want to go back to media literacy, like on how to improve oneself's media literacy. We said, okay,
Mhm.
we need to like be aware of your own biases, and that, my friends, requires you have to know yourself. You have to like really look at all your shit and be like, hey, maybe I think this because of. Um, is there other steps we can take to improve our media literacy?
Yeah, sure thing. Another really helpful media literacy technique is to understand the difference between news and entertainment. So,
Mm,
being very cognizant and aware of what those two distinct types of data are is really important. It's it's important from a mental baseline perspective and also decisions that are relevant and necessary to come from factual information and not entertainment.
mm.
So it is really important for in these moments to seek out data from news sources, for example,
Yeah,
and not be,
accurate news sources.
yeah, yeah, and not be forming any foundational beliefs or decisions from pure entertainment.
Mm. But I mean, here I already hear like all the marketing people and the audience. You know, there are a few. But what about like? I mean, we know this, and we already have like hybrids of like infotainment to make
Hmm.
people listen to news more if it sounds fun. Right? Like, like I don't know. We also created part loads of this mess. Like how do we get out of that? Right? Because so many people tune if they hear this is the 8 o'clock news. Like they were already like tapped out.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. That's a really good point and also a really good question. So whenever people do have the mental energy and capacity, what they need to do is take a moment and just say, okay, have I gone to the actual source of the information, or
Mm.
have I just heard it second and third hand from other people? Like you're saying, these infotainers. So if we have a true decision to make that affects us on a political level, when it comes to who our government representatives are, healthcare choices, things that the politicians are voting on and acting on.
Yeah.
Have we truly gone to those sources? Have we gone to government sources to see what
Yeah.
our governments are saying, what the politicians are saying, et cetera, whoever the decision maker is? Have we compared the original data from the decision makers, or are we just repeating what we've heard through our local news, through these
Yeah.
infotainers, et cetera? And so it's that distinction that's really important.
Okay. Can we also, I mean, this is a lot of work, right? Can we also kind of like, I don't know, crowdsource this? Can we like establish people that we know we trust their body of work, or can we crowdsource this in I don't know in our community because we cannot keep up with everything and like source check with everything. Like I feel this is already giving me a headache.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I love that you actually brought that up because establishing trusted community members is one of the best things that you can do in
Mm,
order to just benefit from a local perspective and as a person. And so I can share a resource with you to where people can go to make sure that they're receiving more factual news sources and information if that's useful for listeners. And 100% agree to look into local resources to see if there are people who are already doing this to the benefit of the local community.
mm, okay. Yeah, who are surely or usually a good green flag is they're doing their NPOs, I'd say.
Yes.
Okay. Are
Yep.
there other ways how we can improve our media literacy?
Yeah, there are other ways that we can do that, and that it's that's a perfect bridge because it ties into our other critical thinking skills that play
True.
into our
Mhm.
media literacy. Exactly. So another example that we have of using critical thinking as an to exercise it, if you will,
Yeah.
and this is to identify our personal strengths and weaknesses. So you can apply this to yourself, or you can apply it to a situation, etc. And so what you do in comparing the strengths and weaknesses of either yourself or a situation, it's meant to be an active mental thinking process intended to help you identify, again, biases that you may have that are skewing your answer into a less helpful area. It's meant to help you be more objective in your assessments and reach a more helpful conclusion over a decision that you have to make. So
Mm,
that plays into the first example that we talked about biases. If someone's having trouble, if they're not quite sure how to pinpoint biases, making a little list of strengths and weaknesses of yourself or a
yeah.
situation, this can help highlight that for them.
Mm, I love that. Yeah, that's is something really actionable that everyone can do in a couple of minutes and just be like, hey, ooh, okay, good reminder. Even and yeah, and you're like, oh, I've already done this, Jen. Do it again. You grow and evolve, bitch. Do it again. Okay, so you've already said media literacy is a part of critical thinking. Um, and I know I'm kind of like this is now like let's talk about critical thinking, and this is kind of like this is triggering me because that was one awful class I had with that we like the School of Sociology had with the School of Philosophy together, and boy, you do not want to be in a class full of philosophists. It's a nightmare. That's probably what psychologists say about sociologists, but hey, it's fascinating, but I was like, okay, okay, no, like, give me a fucking break.
We've
So,
all got our comfortable groups.
we do. So, critical thinking. How do we even start untangling it so that so it we can make a space for it, so it can like cultivate it again.
Absolutely. I love that question. That's a great question. I'm actually going to share my favorite example that I really encourage people to engage with whenever it comes to beefing up and improving their critical thinking skills. And it's called judging and adjudicating. And
Mm,
what this means is to write a list of pros and cons for both sides of an argument. And
mm.
what this exercise does is it's meant to help you see things from a new perspective and open up new opportunities or new decisions that you may not have reached otherwise on your own.
Oh, okay, yeah. So it's really okay. Yeah, makes sense. So you're getting to see the difference between I'm judging and
Mhm.
I'm thinking critically, right?
100%.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So the judging side typically tends to have more biases, more unconscious thoughts, old beliefs that we have. That's typically what comes up in the judging column for people, especially if they're lacking true depth of knowledge on whatever the topic is, whatever the argument is. And it's meant to
Mhm.
highlight this because normally that list would tend to be pretty short and that would highlight to you, okay, maybe I don't naturally have true, like deep, in-depth knowledge of whatever this topic is because the adjudicating side is meant to be more objective. It's meant to be more fact-based, that type two
Logical,
thinking.
rational.
Yes, 100%, exactly. And so if the list is short, just, for the sake of argument, that's to highlight to you, I need to go get more resources.
I need to get more data points and
Yes,
justify so I can form more of a more rational, thoughtful, logical, open-minded.
yes, a more holistic picture of true
Yes.
pros and cons with more
Right.
factual information. And hopefully, again, this is when we add another layer of media literacy. It would also encourage you to go to multiple sources, trusted sources, not just, far right or far left, for example. You would try to go to those more centralist, trusted data
Yeah.
sources.
I always, I, for me, I don't know if that's scientifically correct. So feel free to be like, nah, Jan. I always feel judging versus critical thinking. A telltale sign for me is I feel judging is very ego driven
Oh,
versus
yeah.
critical thinking is more mission oriented, right? It's not about
Yes,
having like wanting to be right or wrong, but like kind of like what's best for the cause.
absolutely. You're 100% right. Yes.
Okay.
And it's important to understand a time and a place. There's a time and a place where it's okay. We're making a personal, ego-driven choice just for us in our personal situation.
Sure.
If you're not harmed, others aren't harmed, go for it.
Go for the Ben and Cherries.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
just not appropriate to use that type of thinking for all situations, especially when it affects others.
Yeah. And that's sometimes here I'm like, but often can we, I mean, with some decisions, right? It's pretty clear, okay, this will affect others.
Mhm.
But often it's not in the rush of things. Is it always very obvious that this will affect others?
No, because that requires the type two thinking. And
Mm,
for all of us,
okay.
myself included, like I said, none of us are exempt from this.
Mm,
Our minds default to the type one. And so sometimes we just have to make a real quick decision right in the moment. And then it's only
mm,
later on to where we have the time and the space to engage in that type two. And
mm.
that's when we realize, oh, I could have made a better choice. So
But
again,
that's like a huge problem. Like I do also like coaching, and that's a big
mhm,
problem for especially smart people who are like, oh, I should have known better. And I mean, yeah, looking back, yes, right. But in the moment, when you don't have the past data points to refer to, you
right.
you don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Try the
totally
best you could.
agree. We're all just doing the best that we can in the moment.
Yeah,
And that's how we learn and evolve over time is being able to look back and reflect and think, okay, I could have done better. Next time I will do better. So
yeah,
I always try to highlight to people whenever we speak of heuristics and these processes, it's truly not a judgment because this is just day-to-day life. It's only highlighting when it comes to disinformation in this instance. It would be better for all of us if we do try to just take a breath and think more critically when it comes to this area of our lives, since we are being all affected on a more day-to-day basis. And that's the unfortunate part. It's this exposure to the disinformation so consistently and routinely, almost day
Yeah.
to day. That's what's negative. It's not so much our type of thinking or decision-making processes.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. You've shared one model on how you would like to train critical thinking. Is there another way or another kind of like nugget of wisdom you would like to share when it comes to really, yeah, make it easier on yourself to put on your critical thinking cap?
Yeah, absolutely. Another example that I can provide is whenever you're using your sources, your media sources, information sources, when people have the time, I also encourage them to pay attention to who the authors are. Are you
Mm,
seeing the same author over and over and over again? Or are you being exposed to a variety of authors across different types
mm,
of information spectrums? So,
mm,
when people do have the capacity to go deeper into their research of their information sources, it's important to make sure that whoever's authoring the information that you're ingesting and making a part of your worldview, that these are respected and credentialed experts or authors, whatever's, respective to their appropriate field, because this can also help highlight any potential biases or people who are being less than truthful in their writings.
mm. But this is already like a huge thing where like social media algorithms really work against us, right? Like when we, I don't know, influencers, we see them a lot, then we're quick. One of those like heuristics then is to, okay, we see them more, so we we believe that this is legit.
Yes.
Or if we see something is shared by many people, like a post by someone, we might assume it's true because we see it so much. There's like this availability.
Yes. Yeah, that's when the availability heuristic kicks in.
Okay.
100%. And so, whatever you're most often exposed to or have access to, by default, that becomes what you believe.
Yeah.
And so, another thing that kicks in is this concept of othering. People don't want to be the other, they want to be a
Ah.
member of the in group. And so, if the content that they're consuming and being exposed to most often is in one group,
Mm,
by default, over time, you want to be part of that group. Even if
mm,
you might not 100% technically agree with everything, or you might have made different
yeah.
choices, or you might have reached a different
Like your
conclusion.
community wiring is just too strong to override.
Yes, exactly. And so it's really important to try to be aware of what you're consuming, especially over time, to not by default end up in this group that is more difficult for you to disconnect from.
Mm. Yeah, it feels like we're describing a cult.
For some people in this realm, it can go down that path, unfortunately. So we just
Yeah,
want to
right?
we want to prevent that.
Yeah, ideally, if we can. But yeah, it really is the just kind of like the consistent day-to-day exposure that's kind of like, yeah, hooking you in unconsciously and giving you also all other sorts of things. And we usually only talk about like the comparison of like that if we watch social media influencers, for example, with all their consumerists bullshit, a lot of us tend to like feel envy and like, oh, I want this too.
hmm
So this is, I feel, more of a side we talk about, and what you said is something we're talking less about, which is even more critical to like the broader scheme of things. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think that
Yeah, I really
helps.
appreciate you having me here so I can talk about this since I am so passionate about it, and hopefully it helps some listeners out. So thank you.
What is I think I want to quickly before we end talk more about the different heuristics, right? Like there's something I often fall into myself. If something looks legit, it must be legit. right?
Mm.
Like if, I don't know, a website looks really well made, or if I don't know, if the dude is wearing a really fancy suit, I'm like, "Yeah, he must know what he's talking about, right?" Like, I don't know, is that like one of those heuristics as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely plays into the fact that people, let's see, how can I explain this? It's just easy. It's easy to make those real quick, rapid decisions and choices in the very beginning. Like you're saying, when you first, we're so visual. And so
Mhm.
when you first look at someone and they have it all together and they appear very confident and very sure of themselves and what they're presenting, not only how they look, but the information that they're saying, there's no gray area. There's no reason on that very quick first glance to second guess or immediately default to, oh, they're up to something or there's something nefarious going on here. If at very first glance it looks good and it sounds good, then it's easy for our minds to just say, okay, I agree. Everything's good on this side too.
Mm.
And so it's it's not about living suspiciously or anxiously about everyone and their intentions. It's just reminding yourself to be open to, I might have to make a different choice as new information comes in.
Yeah,
So if someone looks good and they sound good, it's okay to remain neutral.
yeah,
Maybe don't immediately on first interaction with this person put them into a good bucket. Maybe they can just remain neutral for a little bit.
yeah.
And
Yeah,
as you
that's a
gain,
good point, right? We have a
yeah,
neutral bucket too. We don't have just a good or bad bucket. We also have just like a neutral bucket.
yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Exactly. And
Mm.
so it's just reminding yourself to be open-minded that it's okay to make different choices as more information comes in over time. It doesn't mean you were wrong. We're all acting on the best that we have at that time.
Yeah, right. It requires, but it requires like a certain humbleness to be like, yeah, that was wrong. That's okay. Like I fucked
Right.
up, right? And
Right. And
being,
it's okay to blame them. Like if someone truly is coming at you with disinformation, that's on them.
yeah,
Like you should
yeah,
be proud of saying, "Hey, I'm recognizing disinformation. I'm going to make a different choice now."
yeah. I got tricked. That's okay. And
Yeah,
kind of like that's what we talked about before, right? Like in hindsight, yeah, we know now we were tricked, but it was maybe wasn't obvious that time.
exactly.
And we always have this belief, this bias that past events were predictable. A fact, which is like, yeah, okay, sure we do. And this is hard, as even harder for smart people. And I mean, it takes one to know one. So I feel you. Um, so I don't know. So we again with the if it looks good and if we judge it to be good. I mean, basically goes back to stereotypes, right? We make judgment
Yes.
stereotypes, and for good, for better or for worse, right? If we have stereotypes for danger, and we have stereotypes for oh, must be trustworthy.
Yes.
So to really check that, um, and there are loads of different ways you can go at that, but really kind of like do that. Then we have what you already said, kind of like anchoring bias, would we rely too heavily on the first piece of information, if that's sounded true or had a little nugget of truth, and then we just run with it. And we have this like exposure thing. If we see
Mhm.
something a lot, may that be a certain person or a certain information shared over and over and over, we feel like, oh, okay, this must be legit.
Right. Absolutely. So it goes back to what you were saying about checking in with ourselves,
Mm,
being open-minded, having a little bit of humbleness, and that we can get better over time. We can become more knowledgeable over time and make better decisions over time. So it's okay for what we're choosing in that moment. And there's always the opportunity to even choose better the next time if we've been open to additional information along the way.
yeah, and I think it's really crucial to realize, hey, okay, I have these two systems, and I tend to be way too sure of my own judgment, even if I lack evidence. And like it has a place and a purpose, and I don't know, to kind of like be mindful of we always like to believe we're so rational, but we're not, right?
No,
We're not. We're
no, we
really
really are
not.
not. No, that's so surprising from the research is that almost everyone, most of the time, is making intuitive, emotional decisions. Even if we convince ourselves that they were based purely on logic or this is a logical decision, unless we truly sit down and slowly go over every
Yeah,
detail, for almost all of us, it's purely instinctual. It's reflective, it's type one.
that's really insane though, right? Like even yeah. And I mean, again, I'm also someone often who's like instead of asking, I don't know, the the difficult question, I don't know, is this investment a good long-term choice for me financially? I'm like, what does my gut think? Which is like super scientific. But right, it's just yeah, it's we're often really irrationally.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I hope no one's being too hard on themselves because
Mm.
for most of human history, that's been okay. It's really been okay to live that way and to think that way and for us to make decisions and choices that way. What we're experiencing now is unprecedented. It is unprecedented to be exposed to this volume of disinformation, this volume of misinformation, even
Mm.
coming at us from so many different sources and angles.
And
And
over such a long period of time in such a high volume, right? Like it's
right,
non-stop, it's ongoing 24/7.
exactly, exactly. So if we're just talking about normal, old-fashioned day-to-day living, it really is okay just to be engaging in type one most of the time. So again, it's not a criticism or
Mm.
anyone or our decision-making processes.
Yeah.
It's just drawing attention to this, the unprecedented situation specifically. That's all. Where we
Yeah.
need to be more purposeful on remembering, okay, this is new, this is different. I do need my system two or my type two for what's happening over here.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I really, yeah, I really love that you said that because we are here in the Scenic Route are definitely not in like the shame and blame game. And it's really, we first, like, this is all very new-ish. So have, I don't know, we haven't really figured it out yet, right? Like, there's
Mhm.
research r- happening, but we all don't really know. Right, as you said, there is no macro solution or macro way on how to approach this yet. Like the research, the research is being done, and I feel until we have that, it's you start from the individual and changing, engaging in more critical thinking until it kind of like ripples outwards.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Mm.
So I agree with you. I encourage people, please continue to use your instincts, please continue to use those gut feelings. Those are important. It's just when it comes to our sources and our decision making, when it comes to this world, this information world that we're now exposed to, that's when we need to be more thoughtful about our type two.
Yeah. Is there one final thing you would like, oh, I really want the Scenic Route podcast listeners to know this and to assure this?
I I do. Thank you. That's a really good question. And it's kind of a two-part answer.
Okay.
And so I do want people to, no matter where they are or what they're experiencing, it's really important to have hope about their own agency and hope
Mm-hmm.
about what they're capable of, regardless of their situation, whether it's currently difficult or not. And also how critical it is to maintain a trusted community.
Mm-hmm.
So if they don't currently have that, if they don't have trusted people within reach to them locally in their communities, I would highly encourage them to start forming those connections because it's those two things that really get us through any difficult times that people might be facing.
I could not have said it better because it is very true. We need. community now more than ever, and we're seeing it being destroyed daily. So yeah, this is really an act of defiance. We become more ungovernable when we are rooted in community.
Exactly.
So, Bree, thank you so much for being on a scenic route with me, for nerding out on how our mind processes information. If people want to know more about you, like where can they find you online?
Yeah, thank you so much. I have loved being here today. So thank you for this opportunity. If anyone would like to find me online, all of my handles on all the social media platforms is at Brie Kara. And if anyone is interested in the work that I do for my business, they can find me at forecastingforsuccess.com.
Perfect. We will link that in the show notes. So if you have any questions, like I'd say go find Brie online and she will definitely nerd out with you on all things System 1 and System 2 and why do I believe my own bullshit. Brie, thank you again for being on the scenic run with me.
Thank you so much.